Okay, so the prehistory of slashers, film noir, and giallo. So what we're going to do today is kind of work our way up from the 20s all the way up till the late 70s. So today's, again, really, I always refer to this as the giallo lecture, but we're really going to cover several film genres. Our ultimate goal is to get to slasher films, which I think for a lot of people, when they say they're horror fans or they want to have a horror movie night, 9 times out of 10, what they're really talking about are slasher films. Friday the 13th, Halloween, Nightmare on Elm Street, those kinds of movies, right? Um, Technically, today we're not actually going to talk about horror films. We're going to talk about a lot of movies that led to things like slasher films of the 70s and 80s. In particular, the movies that we refer to as giallo. Because my argument, and it's not unique to me, but my argument here is that most slashers, at least in the 80s, were essentially giallo movies. But giallo movies, to a large degree, were imitating a lot of American films. So the film you guys watched for this week was the film Suspiria from 1977, directed by Dario Argento. And if you watched it, which hopefully you did, it probably struck you as a very different kind of movie. First off, it was Italian. The sound probably was very different. It was all what we call ADR, which basically means they recorded the dialogue after the fact. It had the colors were weird. It was a lot of students in the past have talked about the music, and some like the music, a lot don't like the music. It just felt like probably like nothing else we've watched, and maybe not like a lot of films you've seen in the past. Again, the director of it and very much the author of the film in a lot of ways was a director called Dario Argento, who is considered one of the prime directors in the giallo world. And again, I assume most of you don't know what I mean when I say giallo, but you will by the end of this. And Daria Nicolodi is who was his romantic partner at the time, but she was also his creative partner. She wrote the screenplay for this and for a lot of the films he made in the late 70s and early 80s. I'm going to come back to her because a lot of the criticisms that are thrown at Argento, and I'm not saying the criticisms may not have merit, but a lot of what people complain about actually comes from Nickelodeon, particularly the violence towards women. She was actually in the film. Sometimes she's been the lead actress in his films. In this case, she was in it, but not the lead character. And when they continue to work together, even after they broke up romantically for a little while. And it is interesting because in a couple of the later films, she is killed very brutally, and some people thought that was on purpose. Although at least one of the films, she actually wrote the scene as well. Um, and by the way, since I'm talking about Argento, I may not talk about him again specifically later. I can't remember if I said this in the introduction to the movie that I had up last week, but in his films, whenever you see just hands, like a lot of strangulation or a knife, that was almost always Argento's hands. As the director, he demanded that it be his hands, which again, I'm not sure what that says about Argento. But if you ever just see hands killing somebody in his movies, those are his hands. You may know he's still around. I think I'm recording this in 2024 in case I'm reusing this in later years. And I know he's got a new film out this year, so he's still making films. He's getting up there in his late 80s, but he's still making movies. If you know him, you might actually know him more as the father of Asia Argento, who, in addition to making a lot of movies, both as a director and as an actress, including in several of his films, she also was the romantic partner of Anthony Bourdain, the famous chef, up until his death a few years back. And again, it is interesting because in some of the films, you're kind of like, her dad directed this. So, um, but the lead actress in the movie was Jessica Harper. She's been in other genre films at the time also, but she's an American actress, even though a lot of people involved in this film are either German or Italian. She is American, and she was cast partly because of her look. I mean, she's really good in it. But as I said in the intro, there's a lot of Snow White imagery here, primary colors, kind of. There's even the scene when she's in the taxi. They're going from the airport to the boarding house, the ballet school. Um, it's kind of like she's going through a dark forest. And if you remember Snow White, when she gets to the dwarf's house, she goes through this dark forest before she gets there. And then she's in this kind of weird magical witch land once she gets there. So she goes from in fact, in the movie, when she leaves the airport, the doors open, and that's when the music kicks in. And at that moment, she's going into this enchanted world. Anyway, Argento did indeed get a lot of his imagery from the Disney version of Snow White. And to some degree, that's why she was cast as the lead, because she does kind of look a little bit like the cartoon character version and these amazing expressive eyes that she had. It, for the most part, was well reviewed. Dario Argento was a well-respected film director in the 70s. He made a whole series of these Giallo films. And later we can even talk about the fact that some people don't consider Suspiria technically a Giallo film. Um, but anyway, he was pretty well respected, but his stuff was divisive because of the violence and the odd logic in his films. These movies are not about storytelling; they're about the visuals, how they make you feel. And so I, as you guys know, I've been trying to include reviews either from Georgia or Florida. Uh, Again, we don't have Bainbridge newspaper or Tifton reviews. But anyway, the one I could find for this movie when it came out 77, it was a pretty big hit, by the way. I mean, it made quite a bit of money, but the Atlanta Constitution did not like it. If you haven't seen Suspiria, don't bother. It's revolting. Jessica Harper plays a dance student who enrolls in a very peculiar school. It's one of those places where everybody can hear the footsteps. Anyway, that's enough. I thought there was another line I was going to read, but I think the first couple of lines said it all. And again, for a lot of people, and maybe even some of you, the violence, even though it doesn't feel realistic, it is a violent film. But at the same time, it has this, again, almost like a Technicolor cartoon. The blood has this just bright redness to it. Um, and by the way, real quick, if couple times in the past, students have said that the movie was a little bit familiar. There was a remake of Suspiria a few years back. And so there's a chance some of you may have seen the remake that was done a few years earlier. If you watch the zombie lecture, this is a little bit of a repeat. Again, the previous movie was Night of the Living Dead by George Romero, and the sequel to that was Dawn of the Dead. And to get funding for this movie, he turned to Italian filmmakers, and Dario Argento was basically one of the producers. You can barely see it, but Dario Argento's name is in there. He got the funding for it, and part of the deal was um, that they would fund Romero's version, but then Argento would be allowed to edit the Italian version of the film. Using the same footage, just kind of re-edit it for Italian audiences. And the band Goblin, who did the music for Suspiria, they did the music for Dawn of the Dead as well. And Dario Argento and George Romero were friends. They were admirers of each other, and they did actually later work together. These are some of the posters of Dawn of the Dead. In Italy, it was known as Zombie. And that's why there's that movie Zombie 2, which I showed a scene from in the last lecture where it shows a zombie literally fighting a shark. That was from Zombie 2, which was the Italian sequel to Dawn of the Dead. Anyway, so again, you can see Zombie, and if you look at the credits, you see Dario Argento presents a film written and directed by George Romero, music by Goblin in collaboration with Dario Argento. So again, they were friends, and they also later worked together on a film called Two Evil Eyes. Basically, it's two movies put together. So George Romero made one movie, like an hour, and then Dario Argento made the other movie, and they put them together as one movie. Again, one of the things I like about this class is seeing how all these films kind of lead into the others. And I'm going to talk about a couple of other movies. So before we get any further, gender is going to come up a lot in this class. And with Giallo, it's hard not to talk about gender, as you'll see later. So I thought I'd introduce a new thing for your film reviews, your discussions. I've been trying to give you some language to use to help analyze the films. So something else that I wanted to add, and I have a feeling a couple of you will know this already, but this might be new to most of you. Starting in the 90s, there was an underground comic book artist named Alison Bechdel. She wrote these sort of satirical, funny comic books. And this first appeared in within her comics. And it was meant to be partly a joke, but at the same time, it actually kind of works, and it's become known as the Bechdel test. Basically, you know, movies traditionally were very male driven as far as who's the main characters, who's driving the movies, right? And so Alison Bechdel kind of noticed this, and through her comic book, she kind of commented on this. And like I said, it's become the Bechdel test. So the Bechdel test is three questions. Uh, First question is there more than one main character who is a female? So the example I always use, which is a film that came out the same year as Suspiria, 1977, the first Star Wars movie, for those of, or as the kids are calling it, A New Hope. Um, but anyway, if you've watched the original Star Wars, the answer to this question is no. So if you watch the original Star Wars, there's only one female character. That's a main character. There's a couple of women in the background, but that's Princess Leia. Everybody else in the movie is male. So Star Wars would fail this test immediately. But if there's more than one main female character, do they actually talk to each other? And again, not so much movies in 2024, but if you look at movies, especially from the 90s back, it is quite amazing how many movies do not have women actually having conversations with each other. Think of Psycho. Psycho really had two women. You had Marion Crane, the woman who gets killed in the shower, and then her sister. Now there is a couple of small characters right at the beginning, but those two main characters never talk to each other. It does come up a lot. So that would be test two. And then if they do talk, like, so if the answer is yes, and they do talk to each other, do they talk about anything other than a man? So often in movies, the women are there to be, in older films, they're there to be the girlfriends, the wife, the person to fall in love with, or in horror films, often the person to get killed. And so often when these female characters talk to each other, it's like, I'm really in love with him. What should I do? Well, this is how you should, you know. So, but do they ever just have conversations like real women, which have nothing to do with the man? Nowadays, it's not quite as obvious. Now, by the way, just right off the bat, there are some movies where you don't want women simply because that's not the story. If you're telling a story about a Marine platoon in World War II, you're not going to have women because it's going to be all male. In the same way, some films are going to be all female. By the way, you can do exactly the same thing with race or ethnicity. Are there more than one person, people of color in the film? If there are, do they talk to each other? That kind of thing. Um, but again, if most movies are supposed to be representing real life, there should be more women. Nowadays, screenwriters are very aware of this. So they often make sure that they pass the Bechdel test. Again, it was meant to be a joke, but there's a lot of truth to this. So Suspiria actually passes the test because there are more than one. In fact, it's mostly women, and they do talk to each other, and it's not always about a guy. So Suspiria, for whether you like it or not, it does technically pass the Bechdel test. So that would be something that could be interesting um, to think about with the later films is do they pass the Bechdel test? If you're looking for something to say in your discussions, this would be a good thing. And again, you can do this with race. You can do it with other aspects as well. Okay, today we'll do a prehistory of slasher films. The next lecture will be specifically about slasher films, but we're going to do a prehistory. What led to American slasher films, these very specific type of horror films. So we've touched on this before, but there's a straight line from the 1920s all the way to the 70s with these. So going back to the silent films and the early horror films of the 1930s, there's something known as German expressionism. Expressionism means it's not necessarily realistic. It gives you the expression or the impression of something. And again, films like Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, one of these really early horror films coming out of Germany, they have a very specific look. But even early American horror films like Dracula and Frankenstein, which you guys watched, have some of that German expressionism. So again, this is post-World War One. And again, the films aren't meant to look realistic. The imagery is meant to evoke the mental or emotional states of the characters or of the story, which Giallo has a bit of that, by the way, with the colors and such. You might notice Suspiria, there's just random light colors throughout the movie that don't necessarily make sense, but they create a very specific mood. And again, the idea is it's not supposed to be realistic. Um, and you have, sometimes what are called Dutch angles, which is again kind of coming from the German, cameras that are tilted, or again the sets are all jagged and chiaroscuro or chiaroscuro is I've heard about five pronunciations of this, but this idea of light and dark. In fact, I'll define it in just a second. So these are ideas that you've actually seen. I mean, especially if you're a Tim Burton fan, a lot of Tim Burton movies and others definitely are evoking German expressionism. Like Nosferatu, the vampire film, is a German expressionist film. And you can see direct imageries from some of, for instance, Tim Burton films going back and coming right out of these German silent films. And again, these are all Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. And again, there's nothing that's supposed to look real here. But if you've seen, again, a lot of Tim Burton films in particular, they definitely use this. So again, the idea of chiaroscuro is the idea of this dark contrast between colors. It's not just black and white, which almost all movies were at that time, but again, that it's very stark. We'll see this in horror films of the 30s, but also some of the later films we're going to be talking about. So skipping ahead, it's kind of skipping the horror films of the 30s, which we've talked about. I want to talk about another genre, which are actually personally my favorite genre of films. I would actually teach this course as a film noir course if I thought students would actually take it. But most of these films are only from the 40s and 50s, and I'm not sure students would sit through 16 weeks of only looking at movies from the 40s and 50s. I don't think I could get away with it, which is why, I mean, which is why I haven't taught it. So this lecture gives me a chance to talk about film noir for a moment. Film noir also has its roots, and I'll explain what that term means, but it also has its roots in these early films of Germany, specifically the films of a director named Fritz Lang, who would then go on to become he would come to the US after the Nazis' rise to power, as many of these directors did, and start making films in America. But he made films like which is an incredible film. It had Peter Lorre, who later made a lot of American horror films. In fact, his voice, when people do like Igor, I'm going to embarrass myself, doctor, we got I can't do it. But there's this very specific voice. That's Peter Lorre. Again, I'm embarrassing myself, but that's a Peter Lorre. He also made a lot of Alfred Hitchcock films, by the way. But he was the lead character of where he plays a child killer. And the whole movie is the police trying to catch this child killer. But part of the movie is getting into how this child killer thinks. And the is because these thieves, because they're so sick of the police bugging them, trying to catch the killer, they decide to catch the killer themselves to get the police off their backs. And one of the characters thinks this is him, so he writes M on his hand in chalk and puts it on the guy's shoulder for murder. And then that's how they know who it is. Anyways, that's where the M comes from. But a lot of these German films, the silence, but especially films by Fritz Lang, were picked up on by American movies in the 40s, in particular, these film noir, these crime movies. And again, they're not as expressionistic. In fact, they tend to be more realistic in a lot of their imagery. But again, some of that imagery coming from the German films. Film noirs have a very specific look. They're very much a part of their time, the 40s and early 50s. Everybody's ultra cool with these fedoras and the cigarettes and the femme fatales. And so what are these? Where do they come from? So again, they're essentially crime movies. And there were crime movies in the 30s that kind of are film noirish. But specifically, these come from the World War II era and the few years after it. So a couple of things. First off, during World War, because it is a French term, it means dark film or black film. So in the 30s to the early 40s, and we've talked about this before, the French were the first culture to really take movies truly seriously. And this is where we get the auteur theory from, right? And they were a big fan of American movies. And then World War II happens. And as you guys may remember, the Germans take over France, the Nazis. And for many years, French citizens could not see American films. And then in 46, 47, 48, they get this influx of American movies. For the first time, they get to see all these movies from 42, 43, 44, right? And they notice that a lot of these films were different than the films before the war. They were cheaper. Some of them were cheaper in lighting, which you can see an inflection of my glasses, the lighting here, right? Lighting used to be really, really expensive. So if you didn't have a lot of money, or sets were expensive. So if you didn't have a lot of money, you would use a lot of shadow to cover the fact that you don't have a set, and you wouldn't use a lot of lighting. Now we have LED, it's really cheap, but that used to be one of the most expensive things. So you would only use a little bit of lighting. So you would find ways to make your film look more expensive. And so they were looking at these German films and going, oh, there's a lot of tricks we can use from those German films. And so the films literally were darker, but it was more than that. Even the big films, the expensive films, were also using this style. Some of it was because some of these were actually German directors. A lot of these, like Fritz Lang, some of the Edgar G. Ulmer, who did The Black Cat, is one of those. Leaving Germany and Austria because of the Nazis, coming to America, but bringing that sensibility with them and bringing that style with them. A lot of film noir are made by German filmmakers. But during the war and definitely after the war, there was a different sense of America. We kind of forget, because we weren't around back then. World War II really was a very, very dark period. It's the event that killed more humans, other than the Black Plague. It killed more humans than any other event, and this was a human event, unlike the Black Plague. I mean, at least 60 million people were killed during World War II. You have the Holocaust during World War II. The US wins the war partly because we created a doomsday machine. We created the atomic bombs and we dropped them on two Japanese cities. Everybody's hands were at least a little bit dirty from World War II. We, um, not just Americans, but we humans saw the darkest side of each other. And a lot of the veterans coming back, they had a different view of society, of the world, and everybody felt this. And so these film noirs, and then this is also the generation coming out of the Great Depression, so a time when it felt like a lot of American institutions were failing. Then we go right into World War II. Post World War II, on one hand, there is this optimism. We Americans won, democracy won. We're exploding economically, but on the other side, which is what film noir represents, it represents sort of that recognition of the darker side of America. Again, think of the light and dark, right? Just like the style of these films. And so there is a sense of fatalism, pessimism about humans. In a way, even though the films almost always ultimately ended with the good guys winning because these were code films, right? They kind of they couldn't let criminals get away with it. But in some ways, no one's really a good guy. Everyone's a little compromised in these movies. They're all a little dark. Um, and and not only that, but Americans really wanted violent entertainment. We see it in comics, with crime comics. We see crime movies. We see crime TV shows. People, Pulp Fiction. People really wanted this darker entertainment. It was really, really popular at this time. And again, these are just some of the movie posters from this 43, 44 to about 53, 54 period. There's again a very specific look of these films, a very specific vibe of these films. This is from a movie called Double Indemnity, probably the most famous film noir. And this gives you a good example of that sense that everybody's a little bit tainted, right? So the movie has a character played by Fred McMurray, who is an insurance investigator. He investigates insurance claims. And he has just sold an insurance claim to a young, beautiful, rich wife, played by Barbara Stanwyck. And she approaches him and says, hey, look, I'm taking out a life insurance policy on my husband. And we have a double indemnity on that policy, meaning if two things happen at the same time, we get double the money. So I think it's if he drowns and if he dies on a train, So she says, why don't we get together? Because they clearly are in lust with each other. And she says, let's kill him off. We'll throw him off a train into the water, double indemnity. We'll make it look like an accident, and you and I will collect the money, and we could run off together. And again, it's very sexually charged. There's scenes together, and he's a good guy, but he's tempted by the femme fatale. And then, of course, he does the murder, but she double crosses him, and she sets him up to get the fall for the murder because she's going to run off with the money. And they confront each other. She shoots him, he shoots her. She dies, and he's been narrating the movie the whole time. And the movie ends where he's again, you see him, he's dying because he's been recording this narration the whole time. So he pays for his crime, right? No one's a good guy in that film, if you will. And a lot of these film noirs had that element. My favorite is it's one of the really cheap ones. Double Indemnity was actually a big Hollywood production. Detour was truly a B movie, directed by our buddy Edgar G. Ulmer, director of the film that you guys all hate, The Black Cat. I actually think this is incredible. It's made on a nothing budget. And it has the best femme fatale, Anne Savage. That was her real name. She's amazing in it. And it's simply a guy who picks up the wrong hitchhiker and things go bad. And it's a great film if you ever get a chance to watch it. So that's film noir. They were crime films based on crime novels. A lot of them were, and again, they're not horror films, but there is a lot of killing in many of these. And again, they do have kind of the feel of horror films. Again, they're very moody. Plus, again, people get into kind of nightmare situations they can't quite get out of them, right? Okay. At the same time, in Italy, there is a fascination with crime novels. Crime fiction has always been popular. It's been popular in France. Oh, by the way, I forgot to tell you one last thing about film noir. So French critics noticed this difference. I never did finish that thought. They noticed this difference, and they referred to them as film noir, dark films, both dark for the way they look, but dark in their subject matter. And so they're the ones who coined that phrase. Americans didn't start using that genre title until like the 70s. So nobody purposely made a film noir. They were just making movies. It was the French that went, oh, these are all kind of alike. And so it was French critics that noticed that. These were not meant to be all one type of movie. They just kind of all were. Anyway, crime fiction has always been popular, but Italy, they became really popular. They became known as Giallo novels. So where does the word Giallo come from? It's simply Italian for yellow. In fact, they sound a lot alike. In fact, if you say Giallo, it sounds like saying yellow with a Southern accent. What color is that? That's yellow. And so that's the way to remember it. And so there was one particular publisher initially that published a lot of American and British crime novels, and they used these very bright yellow covers, Giallo covers. And then other publishers, this is in the 40s, and other publishers imitated that. And so very quickly, yellow became the color for crime. And even today, there are still Italian publishers that will publish novels with these bright yellow covers. In the same way, back in the 80s and 90s, if you went to a bookstore, you knew where the horror novel section was because all the covers were black. At this time, again, they were all yellow. And so that name stuck. And one of the authors they really liked was a guy named Edgar Wallace, who was a British crime novelist. A lot of American film noir are also based on Edgar Wallace novels. I'm going to come back to Edgar Wallace in a little bit. Okay, so just kind of keep that in mind. So these Italian crime novels get really popular. Then the movie Psycho, which we talked about. We're going to bring it up almost every lecture. In a lot of ways, Psycho is a film noir. It's both kind of the last of the film noirs. Anything after Psycho is usually known as neo-noir, new noir. But 60s, 70s, and even up till now, these are films that are purposely imitating the movies from the 40s. But Psycho, to a large people, including me, it's really kind of the last of these noir films. And even by the time it came out, noir was really kind of over with. It's also the very first modern horror film. It's both at the same time. I mean, if you really think about it, the look of Psycho, especially the up until the shower scene, I mean, it's basically film noir. You have this lead character who's ultimately a good person, but tempted by sex. Uh, uh, but this time by the male. Was that homme fatale? I can't remember the exact hombre fatale. Anyway, she's tempted by the guy, and she's tempted to take the money and run away with the money, and then, but right before she gets a conscience, she's killed, right? But the look of the film, the vibe of the film, everyone's a little tainted, no one's perfect. It is film noir. And then it turns into a horror film. But even that, with the idea that at the end it's not totally resolved. Norman Bates is still, and again, it does have that nightmarish, noirish quality. So Psycho is a good example of so you have technically, in my opinion, seen a film noir in this class, and that's Psycho. And it mixes a lot of the elements of film noir, but it also had a lot of elements that's going to lead to the Giallo films. Basically, Giallo films are going to blatantly imitate Psycho. So film noir is coming out of the Germans in crime fiction. You get film noir in the 40s and up to about the early or mid 50s. There's a few last ones, Psycho being the last. And then they kind of go away in America. But in Germany, they get really into film noir. I mean, so it's kind of weird. We get it kind of from the Germans, and then the Germans sort of took it back. And in fact, it was some of the same directors, Fritz Lang, Edgar G. Ulmer. They basically went back to Germany and they kind of made crime films. So you get German Krimi films, which is just German for crime films. And these German Krimi films are very similar to film noir, but they're a little more like a slasher, just a little. They're a little more focused on the violence, a little bit more focused on the murder aspects of them. They're a little more gaudy, if you will. And a lot of these are based on Edgar Wallace novels, which is funny because they're British novels. They always take place in London. So you have all these German actors, clearly in Germany, pretending to be English in London. They're actually really good films. So they have, again, a lot of the look of film noir, but they're very European and kind of flashy. But they're definitely evoking Psycho at the same time. A lot of crimes involving knives, and especially young women, young blonde women getting killed. So again, kind of blending the horror parts of Psycho with the film noir parts of Psycho. And you can find a lot of these on YouTube, and they're pretty good if you're interested in seeing some of these. They do kind of run together. There's a whole bunch of these, and they're all really, really similar in the way they feel. Again, just a couple more of these German krimi films. And again, you can see there's a real line there, kind of like Psycho, blending film noir and horror. Not quite horror, but elements of horror there. In fact, if I didn't tell you anything, you'd probably think these are horror films instead of crime films. And so those were around for a little while. They kind of fade away in the late 60s, but their height was the early 60s. And they were really popular in Italy. Remember, Italy liked crime fiction. They also liked American film noir. Psycho was a massive hit in Italy. They loved Edgar Wallace, which those German krimi films were based on Edgar Wallace novels. So you have all these elements. And you get a movie called uh, Black is it not Black and Black Lace, Blood and Black Lace. I gotta have their own title there. But you get this one movie made by a guy named Mario Bava. So Italy has always been kind of an interesting film culture. On one hand, you do get a lot of really amazing movies coming out of Italy. I mean, some of the really big deal, major films do come out of Italy. But kind of like America, we have the Oscar-winning films, and then you have your MCU and you have your DC films and your action films, the films that most people go see. Sort of your average person in Italy, those films that they would have gone and seen had a very distinct style. First off, they tended to imitate American films a lot. Like they made a lot of westerns, they made a lot of biblical films, whatever genre was big in America, they would pick it up and kind of imitate it. And so one of the things they did, and you notice this in Suspiria probably, is because they didn't have a lot of money. You forget Italy was destroyed in World War II. So they didn't have a whole lot of money to make movies. It wasn't like Hollywood. That's why a lot of foreign films, at least up until like the 70s, look cheap because they just didn't have the money that we have. So one of the ways that they save money is that they would just they would just film silent. They wouldn't worry about mics and all that because that's expensive. And then they would add in the voices later, what we call ADR. And that also allowed them to cast an international group of actors. And so that way they'd always have some American actors to get Americans in. They'd always have some French actors, some German actors. And again, the idea was that they can market this in all these different countries, focusing on that particular actor. Clint Eastwood gets famous by making Italian Westerns. Again, in Suspiria, you got Jessica Harper in there. You got a film noir actress, Joan Bennett, who also made a lot of Hitchcock films. She's in there. So what happens is everybody acts in their own language. And so if I was acting, I would talk English, and then there might be an actor who would respond in Italian, and then another actor would respond in French, and another one would respond in German. And I would just go, mm-hmm. Maybe I don't have a clue what they just said to me. And then what we would all do is after we filmed it, we would all go into a studio and I'd record all my lines in English. And then they'd get American actors to dub all the other lines in English, or they would do the same for German or same for French or same for Italian, right? So that's why, again, they all have that. Even when they're an American actress or actor, they sound like they're dubbed. That's because they are, even if it's their actual voices. So again, that just gives them kind of this odd element to it. But in Giallo, it kind of works because Giallos are kind of weird, as you saw with Suspiria already. They're kind of dreamlike, and so that dubbed voice gives it even more of that. Um, Again, a lot of Italian films tend to be very visual anyway. They're very striking. If you're a Tarantino fan, he imitates a lot of Sergio Leone. He's a director of Italian westerns, and they're very visually striking. And a lot of Tarantino's look at his films are coming from those Italian. They're operatic. I mean, opera is huge in Italy, and they tend to be very bold. And again, there's this dreamlike quality, lots of music, and a lot of their stuff because of the language issues and the sound issues. There's a lot of just long things that just happen without any dialogue, right? And again, you see this a lot in Giallo, and not that worried about plot. Giallo is definitely that, but even some of the others, plot doesn't really matter. It's how does this movie make you feel, right? This is one of these. I'll just play some of this. This is a scene. I believe this is Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. I think it's this one. I put my headphones on so I can hear it. I'm going fast. Oops. So that's Eli Wallach. He's an American actor. That's Clint Eastwood, another American actor.
Two can dig a lot quicker than one. Dig. You're not digging.
Sorry, I'm trying to get to a certain point here. So again, notice it's not a lot of talking, a lot of big visuals, get this music going. Again, it's not a whole lot of plot. It's just a lot of visuals. Goes on forever. Oops. Anyway, so you may have seen some of these. That's Good, the Bad, the Ugly. It's great. It's actually a great film, but again, it has just this very Italian feel to it. So Mario Bava is the one that sort of started what we call Giallo. He was a major film director in Italy. He made lots of different kinds of movies. He made comedies, he made gladiator films, he made science fiction films, he made action films, crime films, horror films. Basically, he made any film that was popular. If it's a popular genre, he would make it. And he had real talent. Some of his films are great, some are not so great, because he made them very quick. But he had a very specific visual style. One of the films he made, which is actually kind of important to American films, is a silly film called Planet of the Vampires. Although it is very visually striking, the use of color and all this. But a lot of people have noticed that some of the imagery in it, and even kind of the story of people going to this planet, and it seems to have this ancient civilization that's died out, but then there's these other creatures that infect the humans that go there, that it has a lot of similarities to the film Alien and then all the films of the Alien franchise. And it does seem to be an inspiration in part to the Alien movies. And again, some of you can find videos where they actually show, scenes from Alien that are very clearly inspired by films from scenes from Planet of the Vampires. I do not necessarily recommend Planet of the Vampires, by the way. It's a bit of a slog to get through. So Mario Bava, again, made a couple of pretty important horror films. One in English is known as Black Sunday, that deals with witch trials and such. And again, he is giving these horror films a very specific Italian feel to them. And he's really kind of ramping up the violence. So Psycho did this. Psycho kind of raised the bar, and Mario Bava was a big Psycho fan, so he kind of went, "Well, let me raise it just a little bit further." And so the movie opens with the sequence of a woman accused of being a witch being executed. So this is the opening of Black Sunday, as it was known here.
In the
And
17th century, Satan was abroad on the earth, and great was the wrath against those monstrous beings thirsty for human blood, to whom tradition has given the name of vampires. No appeal for pity or mercy availed. Brothers did not hesitate to accuse brothers, and fathers accused sons in the frantic attempt to purify the earth of that horrible race of blood-devouring assassins. But before putting them to death, human justice anticipated divine judgment by burning into the flesh of those damned ones the brand of Satan.
Asa, daughter of the House of Vaida, this High Court of the Inquisition of Moldavia has declared you guilty. I, the second-born son of Prince Vaida, as Grand Inquisitor, do condemn you. And as your brother, I repudiate you. Too many evil deeds have you done to satisfy your monstrous love for that serf of the devil, Igor Yavutic. May God have pity on your soul in this your final hour. Cover her face with the mask of Satan. Nail it down. May the cleansing flames reduce her foul body to ashes, so that the wind will obliterate all trace of her existence.
Griavi! It's I who repudiate you, and in the name of Satan I place a curse upon you. Go ahead. Tie me down to the stake, but you will never escape my hunger, nor that of Satan! The unchained elements of the powers of darkness are lying in ambush. Beware, Griavi. My revenge will strike down you and your accursed house, and in the blood of your sons and the sons of their sons I will continue to live, immortal! They will restore to me the life that you now rob from me. I shall return to torment and destroy throughout the nights of time.
So pretty strong stuff for 1964. And then that's the beginning of the movie. And she gets reincarnated and comes back and wreaks havoc. That was a huge hit. And it was a huge hit in America, although they did cut a little bit of it out in America because some of it went a little strong. So then he made a movie called Blood and Black Lace. Now that was a straight up horror film. Blood and Black Lace took elements of horror, but elements of crime films and film noir, and especially Psycho, and kind of blends them all together into kind of this new mix. And again, it was in color, this great use of color lighting and brightly lit sets. It just had a very distinct look, and it was a huge hit. And again, it's not quite film noir, it's not quite horror, it's this weird in between thing. And so let me play you a clip from this one. And again, this is from Blood and Black Lace by Mario Bava. And again, as you watch this, and I may fast forward a little bit just because of time, it's going to feel a little bit like a horror film. You have a young woman going inside a strange place. And as the audience, we know there's a killer. So we're kind of waiting for the killer to strike.
Franco! Franco!
And again, notice just all the color throughout. Think Suspiria and the way it looked. You can see where that's getting its style from. Oops. So again, that felt like a lot of horror films that you've seen. The young woman trying to run away from a killer, and there's these jump scares, and then there's the kill at the end. The look of the killer is something you're going to see throughout Giallo. And I'll come back to this. There's a very specific look that also is going to be evoked in slasher films in the 80s. So Blood and Black Lace really today is considered the first true Giallo movie. It had all the elements of Giallo. In fact, many of the other films, including Suspiria to a degree, is just kind of evoking this film. So again, using Psycho, film noir, but also something else, something we've barely talked about, Hammer films. Hammer was a film studio in England, and in the 50s, they made a whole series of horror films. They started with Dracula, then they made Frankenstein, they made all the 30s horror films. They remade them in Britain. But the big difference with the Hammer films is they were in color. They were in bright color. And for the first time, you see blood in movies. Not a ton of blood, but they actually showed bright red blood in their movies. So Mario Bava, on one hand, was imitating the look of Psycho, the stark black and white film, but he blended it with the bright, vibrant colors of the Hammer films and put them together. And again, if you're a fan of Christopher Lee from Lord of the Rings and Star Wars, he was the big, along with Peter Cushing, he was the big star of the Hammer films. Um, and so again, the Hammer films, which the one kind of big group of horror films that we skipped, very much was influencing these giallo films. So, but after Blood and Black Lace, and again, I have it as Black and Black Lace, I realize, after Blood and Black Lace, then that starts the giallo cycle, if you will. And again, there's a whole style of these films, and in many ways, they were very, very much cookie cutter to some degree. The plots didn't really matter. It was about, as they say in slasher films, it's about the murder scenes, the kills, right? Um, except for a few directors, Dario Argento would definitely be one that would use this genre and really do something with it. And Mario Bava would do this a little bit too, but for the most part, I mean, there's hundreds of these that came out for about 15 years. And there is a very set style to these. So technically, what is a giallo? And they are this type of film that once you recognize them, within 5 minutes, you could maybe even less, you can tell it's a giallo film pretty quickly. So a couple of weird things about it. One is they tend to have these very elaborate titles. Um, a lot of times, for some reason, using animals. So, lizard in a woman's skin, cat of nine tails, the black belly of the tarantula, hatchet for the honeymoon, the night Evelyn came out of the grave, your vice is locked in a room and only I have the key, $5 for an August moon. And Dario Argento's first giallo, which is actually really, really good, the bird with the crystal plumage. Um, they tend to have these vibrant colors, which we've already seen with Mario Bava, and you guys have seen with Suspiria. They just have this very distinctive look. A term we need to talk about a little bit. They are very misogynistic. It gets a little tricky to talk about because horror films and horror novels have a long tradition of women in particular being victimized by the monster or by the killer, right? So that is not unique to Giallo. But Giallos do seem to revel in the killing of beautiful women. You know, it does seem to be something that comes up. Suspiria, a little less so, because Suspiria was almost all women on both sides of the fence, but usually it is a man brutally killing a woman. And it's kind of hard to use any word other than misogynistic. This is a little bit of a generational thing, as misogynistic technically means hatred of women or severe aversion to women. And usually, at least when you're talking about movies, for a movie to be misogynistic, it's usually like real violence towards women. We use it nowadays sometimes when I would argue maybe the word sexist might be a better term. Sexist means to discriminate based on sex or gender. Misogyny is really like the next level, right? It's not just discriminating, it's outright hatred, right? Or even violence. But we tend to use misogyny today kind of interchangeably with sexist. But these films, again, it's kind of hard not to use misogynistic with these. And that goes for some of the slasher films as well. And when we get into slashers, we'll talk a little bit more about this. Um, because slasher films do tend to have a lot of women getting killed, but they also have a lot of women killing the killer. In other words, what we call the final girl. So are they empowering or are they suppressing women? Or neither, or both. But with Giallos, again, it is kind of hard not to see them as misogynistic at times. And some of these films I admire, others I actually myself have a hard time watching some of these. And again, I mentioned earlier, Dario Nicolodi was a major screenwriter for a lot of these Giallos, especially Argentos. And even today, a lot of fans of Giallo are female fans. So, um, again, it depends on the viewer if you find these offensive or not. Some people do, some don't. There is this again, and this is tied in with the misogynistic imagery. There is this what you might call erotic sadism. I mean, Psycho touched on that, and a lot of other horror films touch on this, but these really ramp it up. This real blending of sex and violence. And at the same time, again, kind of partly coming out of Psycho. Um, a lot of the kills are from the killer's point of view. In other words, you as the audience member are almost committing the murder yourself. And the same way Hitchcock was making you the voyeur, these films are making you the killer because the camera is the eye of the killer a lot of times. So here's a scene. I have to admit, the next few clips are a little rougher. I mean, they're still 70s special effects, so they're clearly fake. But the level of violence is a little stronger in these, and this has a little flash, actually, I think, of nudity. So this is a film from a Mario Bava movie known as Bay of Blood. And if you're a fan of the Friday the 13th movies, this might look familiar. In fact, there is an exact duplicate of this in one of the Friday the 13th movies. So again, the point of view of the killer. You are the killer. So this is a movie where people are staying at a house by a lake in the woods. And again, if you've seen this Friday the 13th film, there's an exact duplicate of that whole sequence in one of those. And that one's called Bay of Blood. This one's a little bit more horrific, but it's still technically a giallo film versus a horror film. Um, but notice, you saw that in a couple of the clips now, there's a very specific look at what these killers look like, but also that whole killer's viewpoint. You see this in a lot of giallos, but you also see this in a lot of horror films. The next time we're going to watch as a class is the film Halloween, which I would argue is really a giallo film. And this is, again, if you've seen Halloween already, you will see the killer's viewpoint throughout the film. The killers in giallos very often are masks, gloved hands. They almost always are male. Sometimes there is like a reveal where it's shocking that it's a female, but usually it's a male. Some kind of phallic symbol like a spear, a knife, or strangulation. I mean, those things, it's rarely ever a gun. And again, think of slasher films. Think Mike Myers, Jason, Freddy Krueger. Again, they tend to kill with knives, and even though they kill a lot of men too, there's a lot of women getting killed in compromising positions. Again, you can see all the pieces of slasher films are there in these giallo films. And by the way, if you are a fan of comic books or comic book movies, uh, the Mario Bava killer from Blood and Black Lace, which gets imitated in a lot of giallo. If you've ever read or seen the movie or TV show The Watchmen, there's the character of Rorschach. And he's clearly from giallo films. I mean, it is very obvious that he's based on giallo films, in particular Blood and Black Lace. And again, like with a lot of American horror films in the 80s, these really elaborate murder scenes, and that's why people went to go see those films in the 80s, which I was not one of those. I like horror films. I'm not a big fan of gore films, but that's what people did. They would go to see, how is Jason going to kill everybody this time? How's Freddy going to kill everybody? Or Chucky, or Jeepers Creepers in the 2000s, or Annabelle, or whatever, right? I mean, that's what you're there for. Who's going to get killed? That's with an element of these giallo movies. Again, the special effects are gruesome, the ideas, but the actual, I mean, again, this doesn't look anything like real blood, right? Here is from a Dario Argento film. This is this is from, I think, Deep Red, I believe is the name of this one. Um, and anyway, so here is a sequence from it. And you'll see a little bit of the uncanny in this one. All right. That's enough. Uh, and if you're a fan of Quentin Tarantino, and if you've seen Once Upon a Time in America, there's a scene towards in the movie that is very similar to that. Um, and here's another scene from another Argento film. I think the term operatic could be used to describe the violence way over the top. And lastly, in addition to these very gory kill scenes, which again, these are not technically horror films, but they feel like horror films, especially when you pull out these scenes. One last weird part about Giallo and a lot of Italian films is it's very much an eye fetish. First off, the people get killed in just the most violent ways. And I'm just giving you a little taste of that. Um, but there is this focus on eyes a lot. You could argue that this partly comes out of Psycho. I mean, Psycho does have a lot of eye imagery. There's, Norman looking into into the hole cut into the wall. There's even after the murder of Marion Crane, the close up of her of the drain, and then it slowly turns into her eye. But the eye is also, I mean, kind of universally, I think we all freak out about anything touching our eye. I know my son, who just got glasses, always says that he's never going to wear contacts, and he doesn't want to touch his eye. And I used to be the same. I wore contacts for a while, and I was the same way. It took me forever to get to where I could actually put the contacts in. It's like the one part of our body that's always, it's almost like the internal of our body is on the outside. Like it's squishy, it's wet, it's also very vulnerable. It's kind of who we are. If somebody comes at you to your hand, you say they're coming at my hand. But if they come at your eyes, you're like, they're coming right at me. I mean, like that's kind of almost our consciousness. It feels like it's in our eyes almost. So we know we're vulnerable there. So any kind of trauma to the eye just automatically it evokes an immediate reaction. And for some reason, Italians, horror and giallo films constantly were focused on eye trauma. You see it in the posters, you see it in the movies. It is just kind of constant. This is one last scene from a Argento film. His films always had a little extra oomph in the way they were filmed and really do feel very modern. So this is our last clip I'll show you.
Why should I trust you?
And that's
You
Daria
could be the maniac.
Nicolodi, the writer of Suspiria.
Here, look, can you see it?
No. No, I can't.
Wait a second. There, now you can see it.
Anyone could get one of those. It's a fake.
No, come on, for the sake of it, let me in.
No, you're fooling me. Go away. Go away.
Look, my gun. It's police
Hey,
issue. Surely that's
I've seen
proof
you
enough.
before.
Please.
I know you. No, not the gun. I want to see your face again.
And again, that shot actually feels very modern, like something out of the 2000s. This is like a movie from 19, I believe, 75 when this was out. Anyway, so in a nutshell, that's Giallo. I apologize for some of the violent imagery, although hopefully the fact that it's clearly bad special effects made it not so bad. Anyway, thank you. And now you know more than you ever wanted to know about Giallo. And next week, we'll talk about American slashers.